Good morning and welcome to this next session in the Dean series. I'm very happy to be here with you. I'm Margaret Heffernan. I'm a professor of practice here at the University of Bath School of Management. I've led 5 businesses, that's the practice part, and I write books and articles about how business works or doesn't. I'm really delighted to be kicking off the 5th of our series with an academic who's deeply embroiled personally and professionally in the evergreen topic of diversity, Dr. Johanna Ward-Grossfeldt. Here at Bath, Johanna is a senior lecturer at the School of Management's Center for Business, Organizations and Society. Before becoming an academic, Johanna worked in investor relations and strategic change management for Reuters PLC, which is now Reuters Thomson, for just over 5 years. And she also worked briefly as an analyst in investment banking, where she did one of her placements when she was on the BBA program here. After all that, she chose the really hard stuff to understand diversity, inclusion, and governance. So, Johanna, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
First of all, what was it that made you turn to an academic career after working in business itself?
There were a couple of things. I think I had 2 realizations. One was I felt very strongly that I wasn't learning anything new. What I was learning was firm specific, but I didn't feel like I was really kind of developing in any meaningful way. And the second was I came across a magazine. I can't remember whether it was Forbes or Fortune, one of those magazines. And on the front page, it said, "Are you one of the living dead?" And it was an article that had done some research which suggested that in excess of 1 million people go to work every day and tidy their inbox. And I thought, that's me, that's what I do. And so I had what I called my quarter life crisis and went back to academia.
Right. And then why did you end up focusing on diversity in particular?
So I was very fortunate to work at Reuters at a really exciting time. We had just got a new CEO who was very forward-looking, and he had really shaken up the corporate board of directors and had brought in both women and ethnic minorities onto the board for the first time. He was a passionate believer in the value of diversity, and I remember him saying that never underestimate the shadow cast by the board. And this happened at a similar time to when Norway, which is my native country, discussed and eventually implemented legislative change and quotas, which mandated having 40% women on the board. And so those 2 kind of issues collectively made me very interested and allowed me to pursue then a PhD in that field.
Right, right. And I just wonder, because I think many of us have had quite direct experience of the lack of diversity in business, lack of promotion, being underpaid, overlooked, undervalued. Was there anything you'd experienced directly yourself that drew your attention to the subject?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I've thought a lot about it, particularly in the last kind of few years. And I can hand on heart say no, that up until that point in my life, I had been incredibly fortunate, and Reuters was quite a caring company, I'd say, and I had really incredible mentors. I think where the struggle becomes more real, if you like, is as women progress through their careers and have a family and have children, and it kind of becomes harder to navigate all these different facets of your life compared to when you're 25 and sharing a flat with your friends. And so that wasn't a motivation for pursuing that kind of topic at the time, but I think having a Norwegian heritage where equality and gender diversity has been very much kind of at the forefront of public debate for a long time certainly helped. And I think it was also inspiring that I had really senior people right up to CEO levels who were showing that this was important to them. This was something they cared about, and kind of tried to break down barriers to facilitate more women in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you did your PhD on the so-called leaky pipeline. What did you find in the course of your researches there?
So the leaky pipeline was not really the focus of my PhD, but it did kind of come from it. You're right.
Okay.
So my PhD looked at the prevalence of women on boards across the world. So if you think about it, in some respects, there are elements of business, right, that are universal. So making a profit, right, selling goods and services. But how you do that is different depending on all sorts of factors. And there was increasingly a global discussion about corporate board diversity, yet the manifestation of that diversity was very varied across the world. And so we tried to kind of understand what were the institutional factors that shaped those different patterns. And so we looked at things like access to welfare provision, education, those sorts of things. And then kind of from that work came a discussion to sort of say, okay, well, you know, we know that there are national level institutional differences that accounts for some of these things, but some of the questions that we're only really beginning to get to now are, why is it that, you know, for a number of professions, like accounting, I believe, there is almost a more women going into the profession, right? But there are very few that end up at partnership level, which is the same in law and some of these other kind of business areas. And so that was a sort of byproduct, almost, the leaky pipeline discussion from that work.
Right, interesting. Of course, in the UK, a huge amount of emphasis since then has been put on getting women into very senior positions on boards, on executive committees. And the 30% Club, you know, set a target for this, which at least in the UK has been reached. How much difference, though, has it really made, this focus specifically on boards?
So I think there are two ways of looking at it. It's to look at the way in which academia has often chosen to look at it is with regards to firm financial performance, right? And there has been very much an emphasis that there has to be a business case for kind of bringing more women onto the board, which in and of itself, I kind of think is interesting, right? Because if you look at the major corporate collapses over the last few years, there has been male-dominated boards, yet we never discussed that there needs to be a business case for bringing men onto the board. But I think the impact is, excuse me, we do know that there, from these studies, that there is evidence suggesting that in some respects, firm financial performance improves with having women on the board. There are also some studies that show there is no effect, in which case women are as good as men, right? And there are also some studies that show that it can delay decision-making and it can make discussions at board level harder. But I think the bigger question really is about providing equal access, equal opportunity for talent, right? And so for having, you know, if you are, whether you're male or female, if you have the talent, the skills and the experience, and you want to pursue that opportunity, that should be available to you. I think what we are beginning to understand is that there perhaps are more nuances around board process and how women and men engage in the context of the boardroom that we may want to explore further. And so, you know, I've had conversations with people who work in the space who are kind of saying that it's all well and good to have 3 women out of 10 on the board, but if they are not given adequate opportunity to serve on the important committees or to have their voices heard in the context of the boardroom, then you'll kind of know further, right? And so I think all the work that's been done to date has been incredibly important to provide the foundations of our knowledge and to provide an emphasis and a focus on the issue. But I still think we have a long way to go. And I think also on the back of the Financial Reporting Council's publication of their stewardship code, which is essentially a document that outlines how they would like the asset management industry to start thinking about some of these broader issues. Cognitive diversity, something that's increasingly coming up, and beginning to understand kind of what cognitive diversity is, what it means, what drives it, and how we can facilitate it, I think is a really important next step.
Yeah, yeah. I really love your argument, that why is it that women somehow have to add to the board, whereas men are just sort of the norm, as it were, so why do we have to prove that adding women to the board will make a company more profitable? Why not just assume that if you have good people from, all ends of the spectrum, that they'll be competent? So it's a kind of, do you think in that respect that women carry an extra burden at work in terms of they aren't just there for themselves, their expertise, their professionalism and experience? They're required, in fact, to prove something. I mean, nobody ever says, well, if we're going to appoint, John Smith, we've got to make sure that he improves the overall performance of the entire organization.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it's there, again, there's some really interesting questions there. I had the good fortune of speaking to a very experienced non-executive director of boards in Norway, and she was a real pioneer and had got a board directorship long before the kind of quota came in. And she said, it's really interesting. She said, a lot of young women are really angry about the quota because they think that if they get on a board position now, people will sort of look upon them as having got a pity role. And she said, I don't see it that way at all. She said, I want to go into a boardroom and see talent, right? And she said, if that means that we have to take some radical steps to ensure that that talent has equal access to the boardroom, then so be it. And so she was very positive, and I was almost a bit puzzled because I was half expecting her to feel like everyone else should have had to fight the same battles that she had. And so it was really refreshing to see that. But I also do think that there is a huge expectation on people. And actually, there's a colleague of mine who's beginning to do some work looking at how women negotiate coming onto a board, right? And so, do you kind of sit back, watch and observe for the first few meetings, get your head around the business, understand the context and the culture? But if you do that, are you then kind of deemed to not contribute, right? Or if you come in and you're too gung-ho, then you're sort of seen as kind of, abrasive, or all of these terminologies that, again, we think of and we often apply differently to men and to women. Whereas, we think it's great or really positive if men want to pursue female-dominated professions, and we don't ask, we don't ask the question that, well, if he wants to be a nurse, of course he needs to be qualified. It's sort of taken for granted that they would be.
Yeah, yeah. I remember when the legislation was mooted and brought in Norway, and I remember at the time that even in Norway there was a lot of discussion of, well, where are we going to find all the women? And presumably just the same 4 women will sit on every board. How, in fact, has that panned out?
So they did a couple of things. The government started something called the Women Database, and it was literally a database that was open to any woman who had, I've forgotten the exact criteria, but I think if you had a master's degree or above, and then if you had 5 years professional experience and some leadership experience, you could enter your details. And they got in excess of 5,000 women who entered onto that database. Now, not everyone there were actually qualified for board directorship and board work, but it gave an indication that there was a pool of individuals with experience who were willing to kind of put their foot out in the water, so to speak. There was also a kind of the Norwegian Chamber of Commerce started a program called Female Futures. And it, I believe, worked on the premise that the CEO of stock exchange registered companies nominated 2 women from the executive committee or CEO -1, and they were effectively offered the opportunity to go on what amounted to all intents and purposes, a 9-month master's program to learn to become a board director. And it taught them things like all the legislation around it, what your responsibilities are, that kind of thing. And then associated with that, they were appointed a mentor who already had a board directorship. And I only have anecdotal kind of feedback from that, but on the back of that, a number of women decided it wasn't for them. This was something that they didn't actually feel was an appropriate part of the career portfolio they were looking to build. And it also meant that the women who were then wanted to pursue it did so with a much clearer understanding of kind of what it was involved. And so, yeah, I mean, there was a term that was coined for a while called the golden skirts, which resulted in some women having a lot of different board directorships. And the debate has kind of abated a bit now, and there is more kind of sense of what constitutes an appropriate amount of board directorships to have, in particular, if you also got a full-time job, right, in your own right.
Mm-hmm. But lo and behold, they did find the women.
Yeah, funny that when they threaten to dissolve your company if you don't.
It's amazing what you can find out there, isn't
it? Yeah, exactly. And I think it possibly also opened a debate, which I saw some echoes on kind of more broadly around the need to think about where you're recruiting your talent from. You know, does your next NED need to have prior NED experience? Do they have to have profit and loss accountability responsibility from a FTSE 100 company, or can you actually consider other forms of organizations and valid experiences? And so I don't know the degree to which it was a direct result, but I certainly think it was an associated result that we began to think and talk about talent and experience in a slightly broader way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, just coming back to the UK, one of the things I'm struck by is that, you know, we've hit and exceeded the 30% target. Never quite understood why it was only 30%, but never mind. But I think what's quite interesting is that having done that, it doesn't actually feel like anything's changed very much. And I wondered if you agree with that, and if you think that there's another chapter to come in terms of the impact of women on businesses, and especially governance, but not entirely governance.
Well, I think that one of the arguments around why it was important to have women on the board was that they would serve as this sort of beacon of hope for women further down the organization, that they could aspire to the sort of same levels of leadership and responsibility. And I think that's possibly the way in which we haven't seen much of a systematic improvement, I would say. And so, you know, there hasn't been, to my mind, a commensurate increase in women progressing and overcoming the leaky pipeline, right? And there are a number of reasons around that. And one of the pieces that came out of my PhD was around the importance of having childcare and having rights with regards to returning to work after maternity breaks, and kind of offering people the opportunity to manage a family life and a professional life. And I think that, you know, that is one area in which Norway had a clear advantage, which is that, you know, you have major subsidized childcare. So having 2 children in full-time nursery in Norway is about £500 a month, whilst here it's about £2,000 a month. And so, you know, there are some differences in the kind of institutional support structures. And I think those kinds of issues, and issues, as you alluded to in the beginning, around sort of the gender pay gap, right? And I think we've seen some of that in the context of the pandemic, right? Where if you read the BBC News website, there are plenty of women who've given up their jobs because they couldn't manage the responsibility of homeschooling with having a career. And lo and behold, because they made less money than their husband, it was costing them less for the women to give up their job, right? And so I think until we've addressed some of those issues, then we're not going to see that kind of pull from the top as we had anticipated, unfortunately. But you know, I don't sit on a FTSE 100 board, and so I couldn't really speak to the degree to which the narrative has changed in the boardroom. I would hope that the emphasis certainly has changed awareness at board level about some of these issues. And I think when we've seen some of the more kind of emblematic social discourse around, for instance, Black Lives Matter and things like that, you know, these were campaigns where companies were very were very keen in many instances to kind of signal their distaste for institutional racism and all of these issues. And perhaps we are beginning to see the sort of dawn of a more socially responsible boardroom across a range of social issues. If you look in the FT, there is increasing emphasis on institutional investors trying to hold boards to account for issues like modern slavery, gender pay gap, all of these issues. And so I kind of would hope that we've started a conversation that is going to engender change going forward.
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought that up, because clearly over the last 2 years, we've seen a real increase in investors doing ESG investment, really concentrating a lot more attention and obviously money sectors where there is concern for the environment, for the nature of society and how it's treated or used within an organization, and for issues of governance. It's quite a tricky thing, the S in ESG, isn't it? Because it, as society, it incorporates a very, very great deal. In terms of gender diversity particularly, what do you, besides the pay issue, which remains incredibly stubborn, what do you think the real issues are that are holding women back still?
So I think if we're talking in the UK, I think there is lack of access to reliable, affordable childcare, I think is a major driver. I think also, and I'm not necessarily sure this is kind of UK based only, but I do think that, whether you're male or female, becoming a parent changes your perception in a whole range of ways and changes your priorities. But I think the UK has, perhaps more than other countries, a very much excessive work hour culture, right? And so there is this sort of expectation of 40, 45, 50-hour weeks. And I think beginning to change the narrative and the understanding around that and move to an output orientation of performance management is much more sensible. And I do think that's hopefully something that will come out of the pandemic, right? Because suddenly you couldn't be there in the office and make sure that everyone was working 14 hours a day, right? But if actually, having been at home and produced, have the same level of productivity, then can we then have a more informed discussion based on experience that suggests that we can begin to move the dial on some of these things, right? And I think enabling men to also take a more active role in the home life, they want to spend time with their kids, and really beginning to address that sort of that half of the equation is important. And so I think in the UK, if we can begin to have a conversation about the presenteeism culture and this sort of notion that, unless you're working 50 hours a week, you're a part-timer, and a move to not just pay lip service to the notion of a work-life balance, but actually understanding how people can be productive and do a good job whilst also being able to be there for their family commitments or care responsibilities, increasingly, right, of parents, those kinds of things. And I know I don't really like the term, but there is that sort of real sense of authenticity, right, of being able to bring your whole self to the workplace, which I think is really important.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you say, because it often struck me, that men and women can decide whether or not to have children, but they can't decide whether or not to have parents. And so this issue around elder care, especially as we have a very large and growing elderly population, it seems to me will kind of intersect with the issue around parental care.
Yeah.
It also strikes me, from my own experience, that it is really impossible to be treated equally at work if you aren't being treated equally at home. And I think women get very trapped in this in terms of where do we start, right? So is this actually an institutional problem, or is it a personal problem? And what I see is companies say, well, it's not my issue how you manage your family and your time and so on. and then parents say, well, I can't do anything because my company won't do anything. There seems to be a huge amount of buck passing here, right? That if you ask anybody who's accountable, they go like that, anybody but me. Do you have any thoughts or any examples of breaking that stalemate? Because it does feel like we have been stuck there for a very long time now.
Yeah, I think we have, and I do think some of it comes down to kind of gender role patterns, and I do think certainly in the UK compared to Norway, there is, I worked in Norway, and it was absolutely accepted that at 4 o'clock, dads said, I'm done, going home to pick the kids up from nursery, whereas that isn't a narrative that is equally acceptable here. And I was a panelist at a discussion around kind of gender equality in Wales, and I was there was a lady in the audience who was I believe she was head of, can't remember whether it was equality and diversity of the NHS Wales or whether she was head of HR, but she was very proud of telling us that the NHS had a very clear policy on the ability of both male and females to work part-time, and for there to be a clear career structure for medics, both men and women, who kind of did that. Now, I'm married to a medic. There is no way on God's earth he would have gone part-time, because that was not acceptable as part of kind of, the kind of training and the ethos around it. And and when I've spoken to, whereas, I have women friends who are medics and for whom going part-time was absolutely the right thing to do and the done thing. And so I think if you are to kind of put the responsibility on us as women, then I think there are women up and down the country who are going to have some very awkward conversations at home. And so look, it's a multifaceted issue, right? There is absolutely clear that we've seen from the pandemic that companies can do a lot more to provide opportunities for flexible working, both for men and women. And do I think that women sometimes are their own worst enemy? Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm the same. I want nothing more than my kids to learn to tidy up after themselves. Yet here I am constantly tidying up after themselves, right? Because it takes half the time if I do it. And so there are no easy solutions, but absolutely, do I think that we as women can take some of the responsibility? Yes, I do. But I also think we need to be met halfway at having conversations both about how corporations can make professional life workable for men and for women, because I suspect there are a lot of men who would like to spend less time in the office and more time with their kids. But there is also a cultural issue there, right? Because that's not seemingly your role. But I hope that that's changing. And a couple of years ago, I taught some, I'm really fortunate. I get some absolutely incredible students, right? But a couple of years ago, I was specifically sought out by 3 young girls who were in their final year, and they had just got their graduate jobs, right? And they said, oh, can we buy you a coffee? And I said, look, I buy the coffees, but of course we can meet. So we sat down and we had a chat, and they were like, right, here's the question. When do I have kids? Right? And I was like, well, what do you mean? Well, should we have them now, get it out of the way, and then build a career? Or should we build a career, have a bit of money behind us, and then go ahead and do it? And I was like, well, a couple of other things that you might want to think about in that context, right? Find the right person. Are you sure that a family is what you want? What are kind of the other? But they had really quite in-depth conversations about whether and how and where family fitted in the context of their career. And whether you agree with that, the premise of that conversation or not, I did find it really encouraging that they were aware enough as final year undergrad students to begin to think about these things, because that was in no way, shape or form part of my decision-making criteria. But they had in part chosen graduate companies and jobs where they had relatively generous welfare provisions around maternity leave. And I kind of thought that was a really interesting kind of suggestion, that actually I do think the younger generation are much more attuned to these issues. They're much better at talking about them, and they are much better at saying when they've had enough of something and something needs to change. And that, I think, is really positive, even if it sometimes challenges me when I sort of retreat to my quite old-fashioned premises and go, well, if you're not here, are you really working? When actually they are proving day in and day out that they are, and they're doing a great job of it.
Exactly. We might have made real progress one day when 3 guys offer you to buy you a coffee and have exactly the same conversation, right?
Yes.
Yeah. But it's also interesting, isn't it, that they had to buy you a coffee because they didn't think it was part of the curriculum.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, it would have been really interesting had they had the courage to have that conversation in front of the whole class, right? Because it might have then engendered, you're absolutely right? Similar observations or comments or thought from the men in the room. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just very struck by it because I'm very clear in my own head that I could never have had the career I had my husband not taken up half of the childcare burden. And neither of us ever worked part-time, but we chopped and changed and negotiated. We negotiated endlessly. But, you know, we basically took the view that we're both entitled to a full flourishing career. And we would figure out how to make it work. And that was very much to your point about focusing on output. This is what I promised my employer I'm going to deliver. And actually where it gets done and what time of day it gets done, that's my problem. And as long as I can solve that problem, it stays my problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, and I very much, you know, the same. I've never worked part-time, and I take, the thing is, I take great pleasure and enjoyment from my work, right? I love it. And so, and I want to be a good example for my kids. And that part of that is that, you know, to show that, you know, you get good stuff from working. Work is a good thing. And I'm with you. I'm also the kind of the view that, you know, as long as I produce and I deliver to the standard, does it really matter whether I do that at 6 o'clock in the morning before the kids get up, or between 8 and 4? And I think I would also say that in Norway, that is a conversation that has progressed a bit further. I think that the potential sort of difference / downside in Norway is that it has a huge number of women working in the public sector. It has a very large public sector, and the public sector has been more flexible in terms of accommodating women's careers. But what it has resulted in is that a lot of women are kind of stuck at this middle level. I think somebody termed it the welfare state paradox. And so I think if we can get business and the private sector to adjust a bit, to provide a little bit more flexibility, to recognize that the notion of presenteeism is not necessarily equivalent to output or to great results, right? And you don't have to be in the state where you can only work for the government because that's the only way you're going to make it kind of work. Then I think everyone would benefit, and I suspect you would then be able to both garner, harness, and retain much more talent in the private sector as well.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, one of the things that's been noticeable is that in the last 10 to 15 years, we've moved from talking about diversity to talking about diversity and inclusion. What do you see as the difference? Where does diversity stop and inclusion begin?
So yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I don't think I kind of have a very easy answer to it, but I think possibly there are some facets of the conversation about diversity that is, so the way I think about it, that is easier to have because it's more obvious, right? And we think about that in terms of characteristics such as gender. You know, increasingly there is sort of discussion about improving representation of different ethnicities on corporate boards and that kind of thing. And so I don't know whether the inclusivity is just more about creating equal opportunities for all, irrespective of what the characteristics are that you think about it, or whether it is a discussion about also contemplating cognitive differences and perhaps less visible differences, but making space for those approaches. I don't really feel like I have a good answer to it, but it's a really interesting question, and it begs the, like you're suggesting, it begs the question, what's the difference and how do we define them as different? And operationally, from a business perspective, how are they different?
Yeah. But I suspect it's also about, in a way, sort of the first phase of this whole issue was, okay, let's hire more women, let's hire more disabled people, let's hire more from members of different ethnic groups or able or disabled individuals. And then we discovered that, that just hiring them didn't work, right? Because they got marginalized, sidelined, stereotyped, overlooked, undervalued, underpaid. And it feels to me like this whole issue of inclusion, which is actually making people feel welcome and equal, is actually the really hard thing, because we actually figured out kind of how to do the recruitment stuff. But the inclusion stuff seems pretty squishy and hard to manage. Is that what your research is showing you?
So we've kind of only just began to have a conversation really around some of these issues, in particular with regards, like I alluded to earlier, about understanding how, if you have appointed a really diverse board, how do you make sure you get the most from it? How do you make sure that those voices that are perhaps counter to what you might have expected, or that you have hired particularly because they have a different perspective, how do you create an environment that makes it okay for them to say and to raise their voice and to bring that contribution? And I think in those instances, leadership, whether that be the chairman of the board or the chairwoman of the board, or that be senior management, it is a really fine line, because you, like you say, you want to make sure that people feel included and that they're able to contribute. But that can probably also result in some challenging conversations, in changes to some physical practices at work. I mean, and so it strikes me, just in the way that you framed it, that perhaps some of the steps we've taken so far have been comparatively easy to accommodate in existing business structures, and that actually to get to the next stage is the slightly harder part, because like you say, you can have targets for hiring certain, hiring women or whatever it may be, but actually then once you've done that and you've ticked that box, how do you incorporate it into make a meaningful and sustained difference? That's the question. And that's, I think, where the kind of next tranche of work is, in terms of understanding at the micro level, how do we make that change positive, impactful, and enduring?
Right. No, I mean, I felt that to a significant degree, certainly as I was, kind of coming up through the ranks, there was a sense that, well, we'll let you in, just don't change anything. And, and then there was a sense of, well, in that case, kind of what is the point? Once I put on my suit and tie and, bought myself a new rigid briefcase, really, what do you want me for?
Yeah.
We had a really interesting question from one of the men in the audience who said his experience of diversity had been tainted by providing additional support to women and ethnic minority groups, but then to be criticized if anyone from those groups failed to make the grade, even though the failure rate was lower than for white males. And I was rather drawn to this question because I remember once doing some work with a trade association represented the CEOs of all the world's biggest supermarkets. And one of them saying to me, when I hear what you're saying about diversity, Margaret, but honestly, I promoted a woman once and she just didn't turn out, it just didn't work out. And what am I supposed to do? To which I answered, well, I've promoted quite a lot of men in my time, and some of them worked out and some of them didn't. And there's always the famous statement, well, no, we're really equal when mediocre women are promoted as easily as mediocre men, right? But this, it just produces all kinds of friction, it seems to me. This notion that somehow women, ethnic minorities, the disabled, different genders, that somehow they're supposed to, I don't know, add the sizzle, deliver something extra, that actually simply turning up and doing a great job is somehow not adequate, that we have to somehow be the saviors of business. How do you think we should respond to this?
So I think your response was perfect, right? Which is that there you can't expect anyone to sort of be Superwoman or Superman just because they happen to have a different skin color or be female or whatever it may be. And I think so there's a great paper, academic paper that's written about kind of how we're kind of trying to make women into the superheroes of tomorrow, and that they're supposed to kind of be all things to all men and all women,
Yes,
and change everything overnight, right? And that's simply not possible. And I think the going back to the individual who asked the question, I mean, I'd kind of be interested to understand what their sort of response was, right? But from a business perspective, why would you expect there to be an exceptional performance rate relative to the rest of your employees simply because they happen to have some different characteristics, right? And so I think there is, it's an old adage, but I think, the fact that women kind of have to not just be equal to, but have to be better than men, I think is probably also very true for anyone who kind of defines themselves across other characteristics, right? That you sort of have to prove yourself, and that the anything that's different to the norm then becomes the benchmark, right?
Yeah.
But they are probably much better in some regards and not in others. So like you said, it evens out.
Yeah, exactly. Do you feel or find that the Me Too movement has affected the progress of women?
I haven't. I've seen the Me Too movement used as a kind of justification for continuing the discussion. I think it has kind of highlighted elements of the discussion. And I think if you ask somebody who was 20 years younger than me, you would probably get a very different answer. And I think actually I did have a pushback this year from some of my students who kind of in the context of one of their pieces of coursework, we ended up in a bit of a discussion around kind of sexual harassment in the workplace. And I sort of said that, I'd experienced things that in today's parlance, we would deem to be sexual harassment, but at the time, it didn't even really register, as being inappropriate or, and the way I framed it was that at no point was I scared. I wasn't uncomfortable. It was just banter, and it was annoying. But I think the movement has facilitated, to my mind, a discussion about the relative power of women in a different kind of context and across a bigger range of ages, right? And so we can now, because we've seen terrible atrocities committed to women, both in my generation and a younger generation, and I think there has just been an overarching increase in awareness about some of these discussions and debates. And I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier, that it's important to have some of these difficult discussions. And so I haven't seen a change in the research to date, but I've certainly seen it as a motivation for continued research to understand how we can kind of get women to a place where they can negotiate their professional life on the same terms as men.
Yeah. What are the positive trends you've seen in terms of the ways that firms are thinking about diversity? I mean, we've talked about, the childcare issue and a little bit more flexibility. Is there anything else you've seen in terms of new initiatives, new ways of thinking about this that make you think, oh, we're getting somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to judge sometimes, right? Because if you scroll through your LinkedIn account and things like that, then there's forever company or individuals for companies saying, oh, fantastic, we've done this, that, we've done that, this, that, and the other. I do think that there is increasingly a genuine desire, and not just a sort of PR desire, but a genuine desire to ensure that staff, be they male or female, are able to have a meaningful life, right? And that there is this sort of slight move away, even in industries like investment banking, there is a move away from this sort of notion that you have to work 14 hours a day, with a couple of exceptions. But I think I have been asked to come and talk to a company that were considering providing corporate childcare provisions for their children. I know we're going back kind of to that. I'm aware of a couple of companies that have instituted groups at work specifically for individuals who identify as being introverted. And so there's a kind of different debate about the sort of introvert extrovert scheme, and that a lot of corporate life is designed around extroverts, but that introverts are kind of, they are disadvantaged. And so, you know, that would be an example of kind of cognitive diversity where there is actual meaningful engagement to try and facilitate that. And so I think the broader issue is that my sense is in the last 5 years, there has been an increased awareness across a range of different social issues that businesses are increasingly taking seriously, that they are responding to. And I kind of go back to that. Like, I don't think I've ever spoken to a CEO who intentionally wants to not do good things.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, they want to do good stuff. They want their people to do well. They want to have good results. They want to keep their shareholders happy, right? But how that conversation is framed, what resources they can employ, how they can deploy, and that's up for grabs, right? But I like to be optimistic and think that most business leaders want to do right by people.
Yeah. I think that's right, though it's interesting because your comment makes me think of a CEO I've been working with recently who, you know, very, very good intentions, always, you know, a short list that is, you know, diverse, always ends up hiring the white guy. You know, and it's incredibly frustrating because, of course, the difficulty of this is the issue, you know, the trend versus the detail, which is to say, yeah, I'm all in favor of diversity. It just so happens in this job, you know, the best candidate was another white male. And, you know, and slowly but surely, you know, he's both invested heavily in diversity programs, and the exco has become whiter and maler, as it were.
Yeah, and I think that's one kind of, that's one challenge around the increased notion in the board context around cognitive diversity, right? So
right.
I did some cursory analysis of executive committees of FTSE 350 companies, so looking at the qualifications of the executive team, and vastly male, a lot of them with very long track records in the company, you know, 13, 15, 14 years average was not uncommon. A number of them with, you know, depending on the industry, but a lot of accountants, a lot of engineers, a lot of lawyers. And if you are recruiting genuinely diverse talent, if that talent happens to be male and white, right, you're still going to have an issue because you've got an all male white board. And so I think the kind of role of executive search firm, for instance, and recruitment agents, I think is a really interesting one, because I went and spoke to one of those companies in London a few years ago, and they sort of said that the problem is that it's hard to identify new individuals, and it's time consuming, and often that time invested may not result in anyone who actually wants to be on your shortlist. And so you tend to then fall back on the same individuals who, you know, are happy to be included on that shortlist, but they may not have the specificity of the skills and experience required. And then because you tend to have a bigger talent pool of men who, you know, are interested, then it becomes easier to kind of put that list together. It becomes less time consuming, less labor intensive. And so there's sort of a trade-off there. And I also know of some women who kind of feel like, you know, if you haven't already got net experience, then they're not really interested. But of course, you need that first break. And I think as long as there is this, but I also think to your previous point, I can also imagine that if you have perhaps made a couple of appointments that were a bit different and that didn't work out, that it can give you a bit of a personal sort of fear of making another bad appointment again.
Yeah.
But I think that then it becomes about that individual recognizing that that is an individual fear, and then working with the recruitment agent or with the executive team to sort of say, okay, what went wrong last time? What can we learn from that? And how can we continue on the path of diversity, but do it in a more informed way, richer from the experience wherein it didn't work out?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is, why are people doing this? And we had quite a good question here from an anonymous attendee who asked, you know, besides the human rights, it's the right thing to do argument. So that's the social justice argument, really. What arguments do you find are most persuasive in getting companies to develop and implement diversity and inclusion policies?
So I'd say there's kind of three things. One is reputation.
Right.
And so it can be that if a major customer turns around and say, look, we're acutely aware that you don't have a diversity panel, or, you know, and it's one of our policies to seek out suppliers that have these characteristics, right? So I think that can be that's certainly one of them. I think if you can make the case around cost in some way, right? So hiring people is expensive, recruiting is expensive, right? But if you get good people, keeping them,
right,
is what you want, right? And if that means that you can access individuals with the right experience, and you can pay them and you can keep them, right? And if that means making some adjustments, that means having, you know, women or any other minority you want to think of prove a benefit, then that's it. But ultimately, you know, especially in the private sector of large corporations, ultimately, it's going to be about performance, right? But like you've said before, there seems to be that we have different levels of expectations around performance of different groups of minorities. And I think increasingly it's socially unacceptable to not address these issues. Increasingly, we understand that there is positive financial outcomes associated with having diversity and inclusion, and ultimately it can lower your costs if you are saving money on recruitment and retention, right?
Yeah.
And so I think those three things are probably the arguments that I've come across in my discussions with people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I did some work with a Swiss private bank recently, and you know, they were talking about how important diversity was, and I started talking about the business case, and they just said, "Oh no, we don't really care that much about the business case," because I was saying, actually, you know, that as more and more women control more and more wealth in the world, obviously they'd want to attract those customers. They said, "Oh no, it's not that at all." They said, "It's just we're aware that, you know, more women have master's degrees and further degrees than men do, and we just want access to the greatest talent, and we're not prepared to think that there's 50% of the talent pool we can't access." And so it's just, we want the best people, and we're not prepared to rule out any group, which I thought was kind of brilliantly simple. You know, it's like, get all the mumbo jumbo and the McKinsey stuff saying you'll get, you know, make more money. Actually, if you want to get the best out of the talent pool, you don't want to be thinking about, well, are they the right color or size or shape or, you know, sexual orientation. You just want to think, where are the best minds I can find.
Yeah, I agree. And the talent argument was absolutely the strongest argument I felt going into my PhD. And so I think it's really great that that's kind of where it's at. Now it's about creating the opportunity for all those groups to be able to show their talent, and to maximize those opportunities by getting access to the right education and those kinds of things, and to have the opportunity to continue to draw on those talents, even if they have care responsibilities for elderly parents or for young children, or, you know, whatever those responsibilities may be.
Yeah. And do you find many organizations that are alert to the just overwhelming body of evidence that diverse groups of people make better decisions?
I think it's hard to know whether they are kind of aware of the research or the evidence, or whether it's becoming a bit common sense, or it's becoming the done thing, or it's becoming kind of parlance. I think that, you know, that's hard to make. I was on a fascinating webinar a few weeks ago around issues of diversity, and there was a guy there who was representing a major African bank, and he made very similar kind of points to the Swiss bank that you're doing. And so I think it's interesting that industries and organizations that we traditionally think of as being very male dominated, as being very much kind of centered on the kind of stereotypical approach to a career, are beginning to break the mold and to have these conversations. And I think they have the potential to be trailblazers and to be quite important in how other organizations respond to those premises. And so I'd say, do they know about the formal? I don't know, maybe a couple of them read Harvard Business Review, but I think increasingly it's more just about the discourse across business. But you know, I don't know. I am the first to admit that I am very much in my own kind of social media bubble, right? So what I see on LinkedIn and what I see on Twitter seems to suggest that. And certainly from the individuals that I talk to who are practicing in business, that's very much a narrative that they subscribe to. But then they also know who they're talking to, right? So they're not going to turn around to me and say, well, actually, I think diversity is a lot of rubbish. And so it's hard to get a true sense. I mean, I suspect you might have a better sense actually of what senior business leaders feel about some of these issues as you're dealing with these kind of issues on a day in, day out basis.
Yeah, and I guess I would say, you know, a lot of it, I mean, it's very frustrating, you know, for a researcher, but a lot of it is about experience. You know, the guy who hired one woman who just turned out to be a superstar hires more women and keeps doing it to the degree that, you know, that the recruitment turns out to be successful. And, you know, Pache, the earlier question, the person who, you know, hires someone of a different sexual orientation or ethnicity, if it doesn't work out well, then they decide, well, you know, enough of this diversity lark. I'll just go back to my good old comfortable biases. Just we're too quickly running out of time. I just had a final question before we have to wrap up, which is, you know, when you think of all that you've seen in the course of your research, what one thing do you think could make a difference and really move this a little further, a little faster?
So I think I'd say there's two things. I think supporting families or supporting employees with families or care responsibilities, be that through flexibility, be that through provision of, you know, childcare services, be that through sort of different working patterns that enables people to deliver on their care responsibilities, I think would make a really big difference. I think, as I've said, the pandemic has been both good and bad with that respect. I think if once sort of care homes are operating more or less normally again, and school provisions and care responsibilities for children are up and running again, I think enabling parents, and especially women, to be allowed to work around the fact that there might not be after school clubs or, you know, those kinds of things, offer flexibility and trust your employees. I mean, yes. That just kind of strikes me. I saw a great post on LinkedIn the other day from a CEO who said, I've hired you because I think you're good. Like, if that means that you have to go and get your kids at 2, or you have to go and check in on your elderly parent at 6 to make sure they eat their dinner, go, right? I trust you to do your job. And I think we've kind of lost trust a bit in the sort of melee of increasing professionalization and accountability and transparency. And a lot of those things are good, but they shouldn't get in the way of trusting your employees to do the job that you've hired them for, because I suspect if you've done a good job on recruitment, the vast majority of people want to do a good job. And you know, they're not out to do poorly or to perform badly.
No, I agree with you entirely. And I think, you know, I think some of the problem is actually the development of all this wildly intricate, sometimes technological performance management stuff, you know, which means that, well, if I don't have proof that you're doing a good job, how could I ever be absolutely confident that you are? Yeah. And I was talking to a bunch of business leaders last week, and I think kind of shocked them when I said, you know, in all the businesses I've run and all the teams I've ever run, I have never, ever outlined to people where they should do the work, when they should do the work. Basically, as long as it got done, I didn't care. And I've also never, ever had to put in place incentives. You know, I paid good salaries, I offered good work, I offered good working conditions and, you know, hard problems to solve. And that was it. And they all looked absolutely gobsmacked, which is, but if you're not measuring people every day of the week and surveying them every other day of the week and, you know, spying on them to make sure that they're, you know, answering emails fast enough, then how could you ever be comfortable? And it, exactly as you say, it comes back to trust, but I think also the idea that expectations drive outcomes.
Yeah.
And if I expect you to do a good job and I expect you to operate like an independent professional person, you're quite likely to do that. And if I expect you to be a mischievous child and treat you like a mischievous child, the chances are very high that that's exactly how you'll behave.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And I think recognizing that different individuals kind of have different sort of trigger points in terms of responses, right? And the first time I came across that motion of, you know, we don't care when or where you do the work was actually when I worked at Reuters. We had some software engineers who got to work at 11 o'clock at night and stay there until, you know, 7 o'clock in the morning. And that was fine because they delivered. And I do think that the trust needs to kind of be reintroduced almost.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. We could keep talking, but time is up. But as it turns out, we've ended up on a kind of perfect note because the next and last webinar that I'll be hosting until next year is going to be very much focused on the issue of trust. I'm going to be talking to Bath's former Dean of the School of Management, Veronica Hope Haley, who has spent years studying the topic of trust and has been developing that research right through the pandemic, interviewing business leaders of all kinds about how trust has actually grown in this crisis. I hope you can join me for that, but in the meantime, please thanks for joining us, and many thanks to you, Johanna, for sharing your work and your ideas with us here today. This is not a topic that's ever, I suspect, going to be concluded in my lifetime, but thanks for covering so much ground. Thanks to everybody for watching. Thanks and goodbye.